thank you very much again for coming along to Eco Views and News. This evening we want to continue our ruminations about sea level rise in Boston, and in fact in the whole Northeast. You may recall that we spent some time thinking about this in reference to New York first, because in effect New York's done some work on this in a way that we haven't here in the Northeast in Boston yet. But New York has done some considerable work on it and deserves some attention. Bill Blakemore from ABC News was the one we started thinking about this with, and in fact he's done a lot to think about it by taking his reporting to the MoMA, that is the Museum of Modern Art, and going through the museum's exhibit, current exhibit. I believe it's on through the rest of September, but it's worth checking out. If you're in the New York area, definitely get over to see it. And if not, try to call up someone who can go see it for you and pick up the catalog and the like, because we're really trying to, in a sense, benefit from what they've already started doing in New York City. Here in Boston, we could launch a similar effort to try to get in touch with, in a sense, the forthcoming problems that we're going to have to envisage. But basically, we're going to have to do it on the basis of looking at the kinds of things that we haven't started envisioning yet, the changes that will occur. Well, one of the fellows who's helped a lot in getting us to think about new Earth and new possibilities of Earth has just written a book. Bill McKibben has written a book called Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H, and he subtitles it, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. And this is the kind of tough new planet, kind of thing that we're going to be envisioning with new seacoasts. He's actually talking on this next Sunday, Sunday the 29th of August at 7:30 p.m. at Carey Hall in Lexington. If you're in the Boston area, get a chance to get over there. You probably want to get there from about 6:30 on, because I think the seats are going to be pretty scarce by the time he gets up to talk. He comes from Lexington. He grew up in Lexington, and he has a lot of following here in Greater Boston. It's all the more urgent these days because of the kind of news that's come out just this morning. I don't know if you people saw this, but it's pretty extraordinary news. Here, the headline is, every GOP New Hampshire Senate candidate is a global warming denier. This is posted by Brad Johnson this morning at 10:17 a.m. August 22nd. It's pretty extraordinary. They list the different GOP candidates, and every single Republican candidate for the United States Senate being vacated by Senator Judd Gregg is a global warming denier. It's unbelievable, but it apparently is true. We're in for an extraordinary electoral season here, where people are in effect denying the self-evident science at this point. It's as if you were trying to run on a plank of water runs uphill, or the tides won't come in tomorrow, or the sun's not going to set tonight. These are people who are denying basic facts of geophysical phenomena. So it's going to be a very interesting fall to watch the campaigns work these things out. Every single candidate from one party has taken on the position of denying the science. On those grounds alone, you would think the public would be smart enough to avoid them, but they may not be. So we have to get to work on our own on envisioning our coastal future. And as I say, you probably remember Bill Blakemore started us off in this vein by going to the Museum of Modern Art, and it's pretty interesting that this is being put forward in a museum of art. Well, it's the museums of art, in a sense, that help us envision other kinds of realities. This isn't a report on what has happened. It isn't a report on what's going to happen in any precise manner. That is to say, it's a way of trying to envision the future, and the person who's taken us through this in the reporting by Bill Blakemore is a fellow named Barry Bergdahl, who's the curator of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art. And it's worth going through this in detail because he goes around the harbor, in effect, the places like Liberty Island and the Statue of Liberty, and starts to point out, in addition here to the Statue of Liberty, Bill Blakemore is pointing to Ellis Island. And these are real landmark areas within the New York area. In fact, they're national landmarks, internationally known, and they're beginning to re-envisage what these are going to mean now in an era of rising seas. They're doing it with straightforward architectural and city planning maps. They're mapping out what is a likely scenario to occur, what areas are likely to be inundated. Therefore, where do we need to innovate in our encounter with the ocean as it increases? And the innovations are pretty extraordinary. This is done by LTL architects, and they're trying to envisage new kinds of interfaces between the land and the sea with parks and recreation areas, as well as new forms of commerce and protection against storm surge. They've come up with an extraordinary image of an inflatable barrier that will serve as a kind of security. Inflatable barriers fill with air and water and rise to the surface, creating dynamic defensive edges. These are zigzagging across where they're seeing the Narrows, near the Verrazano's Narrows Bridge, that will save New York from storm surges, according to these plans. And what they're seeing is something very similar to, as they refer to it, in fact, as a city on the water, quite literally on the water, somewhat like Venice in Europe. And it's worth listening to it in detail for this reason. We're going to ask ourselves whether the Venice analogy is apt.
We're getting a tour from curator Barry Bergdahl of the Museum of Modern Art's visionary designs that show how New York City could flourish with 6-foot sea level rises this century due to global warming, and up to 30 feet in a bad storm surge.
This is a site that includes two of the best-known landmarks anywhere in the country, Liberty Island and Ellis Island. This area, with just normal sea level rise, would be about 65% underwater by the end of the century. With storm surges, it would disappear.
This is the Statue of Liberty right
This
there.
is the Statue of Liberty.
And that's
Ellis Island. These are going to be protected by slightly higher walls. So what they do is they actually go in and rework all of the landfill that's here. They take...
Okay, that's an interesting way to think of it. They rework all the landfill that's there and envision what it's going to be like, what it's going to need to be like with a rising sea level. Now remember, several things go on at once. Now that sea level is an average of high tide and low tide, and it includes these surges with storms. So it's a very tricky planning process, but they've gotten down to it with the drawings and with the architectural detail that you'd expect from a thorough consideration of these kinds of things. What's interesting is that the public is being drawn in a museum to think about these things, in a sense, think out loud with each other, as well as with the city planners.
A lot of it away, and they pile it in new places. And the result is a series of fingers, 5 in total, with a very crenellated coastline.
Okay, get used to the term, a very acrenolated coastline. That's one with a lot of interface, a lot of different kind of surfaces that interface along that coastline.
That creates, therefore, an area that, as we've seen in earlier projects, extending the coastline makes for a more absorptive place where the land meets the sea, fields for outdoor concerts, and even the possibility of pulling up in your boat and attending a concert.
Pulling up in your boat for a concert.
Yeah.
It is Venice life.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful. The key message here is sea level rise could be opportunity rather than disaster. Let's think about how we're going to live in a more aqueous city.
Okay, let's think how we're going to live in a more aqueous city. As Bill Blakemore added, it is Venice-like, is what he said. It is Venice-like, Venice-like. So that's the metaphor that's being pursued here. And of course, the architects take it to an extraordinary degree of detail.
This outdoor theater?
This is the outdoor theater.
Right.
This is the outdoor produce market. This is a water lodge. So you could have a kind of Aqueous holiday here with various
right behind Ellis
games,
Island.
right? This is an ecological park, bird habitat. Now, this is a site on the east side of New York Harbor in the Gowanus Canal. I think the Gowanus Canal has recently been designated as a Superfund site by the Environmental Protection Agency.
Because it's so polluted.
It's one of the most polluted places in the country. This is Kate Orff, landscape architect, teaches at Columbia University, and she tackled this site where so many others have tread before, but in a very, very innovative way. New York City in the 17th century was the oyster capital of the world. In fact, it was into the early 20th century, and this whole project is devoted to oysters. She even calls it oyster texture.
Oyster texture.
That oysters clean many times their weight in water, gallons and gallons of water every day.
They are filtered.
They are the vacuum cleaners of the sea. She's going to use these oysters for two things: to clean the water in the canal, and then she's going to move these oysters out into the harbor. Why bring them out into the harbor? Because oysters create a natural reef. They emit a kind of glue-like substance and glue themselves one to another as soon as they find the first thing to attach to. So she wants to create a reef out of oysters just like New York Harbor had before it was dredged. But the thing that she wants to use is this fuzzy rope, because it's fuzzy. And that means that very young oyster, I think they're called larvae, will attach to this, and this will get the reef going much more rapidly. What you can see most beautifully in this model, with this field of posts into which is woven almost like a spider's web of fuzzy rope.
And that's the beginning of the oyster reef right there.
That's the beginning of the oyster reef. And you can see it's going to also bring with it a restoration of the marine ecology of New York Harbor. Aquatic birds, underwater life, and us, too. Humans out in kayaks, eventually even imagining some scuba diving if you wanted to get up.
Scuba diving in a slightly warmer New York after all.
Well, the water is getting warmer as well as higher.
This is such an extreme difference from what we're usually getting from scientists and other experts about how we have to tremble and get ready and terrified for global warming. Obviously, there are some serious problems with famine and other refugee problems. But this is such a positive-minded and real-sounding approach.
Okay, a positive-sounding and real-minded approach. What you're seeing there is a demonstration of an idea of biogeoengineering, an attempt to restore the oyster reefs in the harbors of New York as a stimulated biological activity in order to implement geologic effects, create a biogeo barrier to the storm surge possibilities. Well, this is quite interesting and very innovative. And as Bill Blakemore points out, it doesn't do away with the other problems, especially on a global scale, but it's trying to envisage things much more positively as something to invite and work with. Well, let's take a look at it as it goes through.
Well, I think that we have to learn to live in the new conditions. So we decided to switch disaster into opportunity. Now, our last project, this is the land that will be lost, this lighter area, will be lost with sea rise. Now,
the Verrazano Bridge is right here.
The Verrazano Bridge is right here. They assume that the barrier that's been proposed out further in the harbor alone can't do the job. The city needs to change. It can't just put up a wall out there and then live tranquilly as it always has been. What if it failed completely? So they're designing
the barrier.
The barrier. So they're designing a backup system, which is an inflatable barrier that comes up when there's a storm on its way.
Now, here's the inflatable storm surge barrier. Let's see if we can pick it up here, because it's really quite an innovative idea.
To protect the city from from storm surges.
So it doesn't come in as a giant tsunami or a big destructive wave.
It's broken.
It's broken up.
Attenuated. Yeah. And architects and their team not only propose to build out into the water, they're not running away from the water at all. They build out a series of piers. These piers are then allowed to collect silt. So once again, they're creating a new variegated coastline. They propose a new kind of dwelling where instead of building up from the ground, since the ground here will flood, they build a framework and hang the houses down from it so that the houses are up above the water line.
So this really is Venice.
This is Venice. This is a
This is Venice. This really is Venice, says Bill Blakemore, and the curator says, this is Venice. And he adds,
new city on and in the water.
I see also
a new city on and in the water. Well, we really want to look at this a bit, and we'll play it over again here just a moment to get that sense of the newness of it.
Once again, they're creating a new variegated coastline. They propose a new kind of dwelling where instead of building up from the ground, since the ground here will flood, they build a framework and hang the houses down from it so that the houses are up above the water line.
So this really is Venice.
This is Venice. This is a new city on and in the water.
I see.
A new city on and in the water. Okay, well, we have a lot to think about there, envisioning our future. And first thing we should probably do is try to think about whether, in fact, that analogy with Venice is very useful in the long run. It's very attractive. It certainly is a way to get us thinking about things. And to talk about New York as a kind of new Venice is a very new and innovative metaphor. But let's take a look more closely at what the metaphor could be, because it seems to me that we need to, in effect, ask ourselves whether this can, in effect, happen. Can you create a Venice out of New York? And what are the other problems that aren't being looked into? What can we learn from the analogy with Venice? In fact, Venice has, over the years, been very successful. For nearly 600 years, it's been sitting on the water, and it's built around the water. It uses the water as a way to transport things, and a way to actually run its sewers, among other things. But in our day, and in the very near future, is the Venice analogy a very useful one? Well, the first thing you can tell about it, obviously, is that Venice has made water into their overall feature. You can tell from the gondolas right on through everything else, but every once in a while, it gets a very sobering reminder that they're very near sea level. And in 1966, there was a tidal flood, that is a high tide at the time of a storm flood. That's the combination that you have to plan for, the limiting case. That just overwhelmed Venice. It flooded the whole city. And Francis Clark, among others, got going about this. As you can see, there's now a fund called the Venice in Peril Fund, of which she's the president, and it's worth looking at, in fact, what some of them ran up against, because I think we need to be sober about our understanding of what Venice is, does, and has as a potential. To do that, we can draw upon other resources that have been put together by people like the History Channel, the Discovery Channel. Various kinds of documentaries have made it pretty clear what it is that Venice has done over the years. And every once in a while you can capture these on the television, take a look. Certainly keep your eyes open for them, and sometimes they even make videos available of these things, so you can take a look at very important points at some of the history of Venice itself.
Awards of $7 million, $8.6 million, and $10.5 million. Call the
These
Jonathan
are taken
Fontenot
off
Law
the
Firm
TV,
right now
so
to see
they
if you
have,
may qualify for
actually
financial
some
compensation if you or a loved one.
Apt ads with them, but take a look.
For 1,500 years, the city in the sea has been winning its battle against nature. The triumph of human ingenuity over a hostile environment. But in 1966, Mother Nature let Venice know that the battle is not yet over. A huge tide swept in, putting Venice 6 feet below sea level and causing millions of dollars of damage. As the lagoon and the canals overflowed, no corner of the city was spared.
It meant that the ground floors were already absolutely water-sodden, and the salt water got into the brickwork, which is the core of the walls, and goes on climbing up. It's got in there now. It'll go on working in the walls for years, and that produces salt crystals, which gradually disintegrate the bricks.
It was a stunning reminder of a fact that Venetians had known for centuries, but had chosen to ignore, that the city is inevitably sinking. From the day that any building goes up, it starts to sink, slowly but surely, because the sediment beneath it is settling lower in the lagoon. To make things worse, the world's sea level has been slowly rising for centuries, a potential disaster for a city built at sea level. Together, the two factors mean that Venice has been sinking about 4 to 5 inches every century since it was founded. In older buildings on the canals, the water has now risen above the layer of the waterproof marble.
Okay, well, you can see there are problems here with Venice. It's not just a great center for art.
The sinking is threatening to eat away parts of Venice's most famous building of all. Inside St. Mark's Basilica is one of the lowest points in Venice. Walk down some stairs and you're inside the original crypt where the saint was first laid to rest nearly 1,200 years ago. Now he rests upstairs, away from the basement crypt where gushing waters have intruded in recent centuries. The crypt room was originally built 3 feet above sea level, but now it's a foot below.
Well, the implications of that are pretty clear. If it's a foot below sea level,
the natural sinking of Venice continues. If some kind of solution is not found, Venice will gradually disappear. Throughout their history, the answer Venetians have come up with is simply to keep one step ahead of the water by building up the ground level with landfill. Archaeologists digging beneath St. Mark's Square have found that it has been built up nearly 10 feet since the first settlement over 1,000 years ago.
Because of the sinking of Venice and also certain changes and so forth, they had to build up the land. And what we see in these boxes, in this core, in this several feet of sediments, is actually that sequence of getting the land surface up to a higher height, to keep above the water. Here's a good example of an archaeological find, which is a...
well, you can see the problem is severe.
But whatever they do the Venetians really have any say in the ultimate fate of their city? Scientists say that with global warming, the world's ice regions are melting so fast that the sea level in the future might rise more quickly than ever, maybe as much as 1 whole foot in the next century. Over the next 1,000 years, there are catastrophic predictions that the seas might rise 50 to 100 feet. That would obliterate hundreds of world cities. Venice would simply be one of the first to disappear.
Okay, I'm afraid that's a pretty sobering idea, that Venice would be one of the first to disappear, but I'm afraid that's what we're up against in a way. And we need to be sober in our assessments of these various kinds of statements about New York could be another Venice when you think of it, because basically what's happening to Venice is not very sustainable in the long run. And the question of whether we want that to happen to Boston, New York, or anywhere similar is going to be a big issue. The idea of building a barrier around Boston has been suggested, and it's part of the long-term plans for Boston, but is it a viable solution? It's not at all clear that it is, because we can't build a little basin that's a different level than the sea level out here. It's not going to work in the long run. We need to envisage new interactions with the coast, but those have to be pretty sober assessments, not just stating that we could be like Venice. Because if we're like Venice,